and want to thank Plug and Play today for the opportunity to have a conversation with Dr. Andrew Brooks. We'll get into his bio in a second, but before we start, I just want to reiterate how I think important Plug and Play has become in Silicon Valley in terms of, they didn't pay me to say this, but how important they are in terms of finding new investment opportunities, not only in healthcare, but across sectors. One of our portfolio companies on the consumer side, Lending Club, came out of Plug and Play. And so we spend a lot of time down here. I think it's time well spent with companies that Plug and Play works with, and happy to be here again today. So I'd like to introduce Andrew a bit, and then I'll ask him to talk a bit about his bio. But it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to interview him today. He was co-founder of a company that we invested in called Tiger Connect, which is a healthcare IT company, which we'll get into. Andrew and his brother founded the company, and I'm going to ask Andrew to talk about himself a bit. But Andrew was the physician founder of the company, but also a serial entrepreneur that was successful in his own right. He's an orthopedic surgeon by background, sports medicine trained, and has spent time in the device industry, in the healthcare services industry, and now in healthcare IT. So let's get started, Andrew. Maybe just tell us about yourself. Give us some background on don't start too early, but maybe post preschool. Tell us about who you are, how as a physician you got interested in business, and then we'll jump into a first couple of your businesses before we get to Tiger Connect.
Sure. Well, actually, being someone that's not really fond of talking about themselves, Robert just kind of threw me on the spot here, but I do think actually there's one factor kind of prior to med school that probably was a fairly shaping thing. I was born in South Africa, and I'm one of 6 kids, and my family immigrated to the U.S. when I was about 11. So, with that sort of being a first-generation immigrant, if you will, we really were sort of encouraged by our parents to pursue things that you can dream of and want to do. And I think that was sort of an important foundational thing to my background. I went to high school and then knew very much that I wanted to be a doctor. I never thought about anything else. In my high school yearbook, all my friends were saying, "Oh, one day you'll, hopefully not have to take care of me," that kind of thing. I stayed in Los Angeles. I went to undergrad at USC, went to USC med school, and then stayed on there, did my surgical training in orthopedic surgery. I was very interested in minimally invasive surgery, and then did a fellowship in that at the Houston Clinic in Georgia. I never took a business class in my life, nor did I ever think about business, frankly, up until the time I was done with my training. When I got out and started practicing at Cedars-Sinai Hospital in Los Angeles, I was looking forward to that opportunity and thinking, wow, this is an incredible institution. I'll be lucky to practice here. And when I got there in 1996, it was quite astounding how primitive a lot of the stuff that was going on in the operating room was relative to where I had just been for my fellowship. Instruments were hard to come by and so on and so forth. And there's just so much inefficiency in healthcare, and that's really what kind of struck me when I got out for the very beginning. And it's like, whoa, there's just so much inefficiency here. So sort of kind of to fast forward, I ended up starting a company that was doing sports rehab for pool therapy in a zero-gravity environment. We had one location that became very busy, and then opened a second one. And as many things occur, I think, with entrepreneurship, so much does revolve around just timing and having to be sort of at the right place at the right time to an extent, assuming you have the right business. So at that time, I was paying off debt. I had a fair amount of debt from med school. I had my practice, which was going well. I had this PT business. And then there was a roll-up going on with a company called Health South that was buying up PT businesses. The CEO actually wound up in jail, but that's a whole nother story. And then there was, so they reached out to want to acquire the business because they were looking for some market share in LA, and offered me a lot of money for me at the time. And I thought, well, if they want it, maybe someone else might. So I called another company called Beverly Enterprises, and unbeknownst to me, sort of ended up creating my own auction process with these guys, and then sold that company for a lot of money for me at the time. So with that, I sort of realized, wow, if you do create something that somebody wants, then you can certainly create value very quickly, and sort of goes on from there. So at that point, I was doing a lot of surgery. I was working in these hospitals. I then was just frustrated again with the efficiency side of things, and wanted to have my control over my own operating room. So convinced some friends, built one surgical center in Beverly Hills, and made every mistake in the book. But despite that very first year, we were still extremely profitable. And I was like, okay, even though I really screwed this up, it's a good business. And ended up building 6 more of those, but all with about 200 surgeon partners. And again, not really looking to sell the business, we got approached by another public company called Symbion, and they wanted a footprint of surgical centers within a certain geographic area that they could acquire. So we ended up doing a deal with them as well, which was also pretty good. Just to give you an idea of the magnitude of that, the startup cost, aside from the money we borrowed, was about $135,000, but the deal value of the acquisition was $120 million. So it was pretty good, I thought. But so subsequent to that, I was always very passionate about orthopedic surgery, sports med, minimally invasive stuff, and from the time I was a resident, I was doing a lot of design work for companies and selling designs of
Andrew,
product.
let me stop you for once. Do you mind if I stop you
Sure,
for
absolutely.
1 second? So on the first 2 companies, when we talked about this, and Andrew and I have known each other for years, and the Tiger Connect investment, and we followed the company for years before that. When 2 things you said that I think are worth discussing in a generalizable way. First of all, you said timing is important, and then the second thing you said is you have a certain amount of humility around making what you called mistakes. So help me understand timing. Some investors will say is 2/3 of your return, right? Timing a market properly. When you're an orthopedic surgeon and you saw this opportunity, part of it was saying, and maybe just identifying those 2 cases, the way you described it to me was moving patients outside of the hospital OR because you were standing waiting for rooms to get turned over for operations you knew you could do much more efficiently outside of it, but having no facility to go to. So help us understand, first of all, in terms of timing, why were those facilities not available, and how did you identify that need and capitalize on it at the right time?
Yeah, so I think with businesses, from my vantage point, I've never looked and thought, this is really the right time to do this. It's always, for me, been driven around looking at my own situation or something that I go, well, this is some kind of inefficiency that's going on that I just feel like I can affect somehow. What happened with the surgical centers is, in that up until that point, I would say physicians, and part of the problem in healthcare, in my estimation, a major problem, are the physicians themselves, because I think physicians are socialized really not to work with one another. They're competitive from undergrad through med school through residency, and when they get out, they don't tend to play well with each other. On the surgical center side of things, I was able to go to different specialties. There were multi-specialties, so they weren't necessarily threatened by me as an orthopedic surgeon. So I could go to ophthalmologists and say, look, let's work together as a team. And by working as a team, we have tremendous synergy with each other. And these cases that are now being done in a hospital on healthy patients that are plugged into a sick person's environment, we can do a lot better than that. And we can also do it lower cost and that sort of thing. So, so the timing side, just in short, it's not something that I typically go in thinking about in most cases.
And what about the, but you identified a need and you couldn't find a solution, and so you decided to build it, which is anyone in the room who's an entrepreneur has already made that decision, but for a large percentage of the population, that's not the reflex, which is, oh, there's a need, let me go build a solution. What about the second point you made, which was around making mistakes? How, across your career of those three companies, and we'll get to Tiger Connect, how have you thought about what you're calling failure in terms of the process of innovating and being an entrepreneur?
Yeah, so mistakes you're going to make. It is never a straight line. People always look back and go, oh boy, that looked like it was pretty easy. You did that, and looked like it was a straight line. Every business that I've been involved with, I've made massive mistakes early on. But I think what really kind of separates you being able to turn something into a success from something that looks like it may not turn out so hot is this this concept of resilience in your personality. You've got to be able to look at the problem, be resilient, and work with people that are much smarter than you around things that you could never possibly know. So I don't need to be able to write a line of code for our current company, and I can't write a line of code. Actually, in fact, if someone asked me to do a detailed spreadsheet for Excel on any company I've had, I can't do it. That's not, but I can hire someone from Harvard, a Baker scholar who worked for me at the surgery center, and ask him, hey, Mike, can you do this? And actually, sometimes, surprisingly, he would even say, well, why do you need that information? But so I think you will make mistakes. I think to have the right team around you so that it becomes much larger. It isn't 1 + 1 is 2. It becomes 1 + 1 is 3 or 4, and you kind of have this sort of larger mastermind, if you will, that surrounds your company.
So as a microcosm to the mistakes part, you mentioned 200 in your second company, 200 physician partners, which we also invest in services, and I can tell you that's a really big challenge. There's 65 ED physicians in my group. That's a challenge for our director. What about the people side of entrepreneurship, from going from your $50,000 investment to your first hire to your 200th physician partner, and the mistakes or the opportunities on interacting with them and then deciding who should be in the bus and who should not be on the bus?
Yeah, that's actually a very insightful question that very few times has someone actually asked me that. What I've learned from working with physicians in large groups together is that I'm not a professional, but I have become a semi-expert in group psychology. And you could be in a group with 20 physicians, or 20 people for that matter. If one person starts really going sideways, they can affect the entire milieu of the room. So for me, in those kinds of businesses where I had a lot of physician-surgeon partners who were independently minded people, I was very mindful of what their personality was like, and sought out people who would sort of fit into the overall milieu of the business. And I have had situations where there are people who are very disruptive to the business, and gone to them and said, look, we're probably not a good fit for you to be with us, and worked out an exit for those people. But I think at the end of the day, people have to play well with each other, particularly physicians. It's probably helpful that I'm a surgeon myself, so I think if I was just a suit, if you will, I wouldn't be able to necessarily have talked to some of those guys in the same way, or girls the same way that I did.
That's great. So let's go back to, before I interrupted you, to your device entrepreneurial time. You had said initially that one of your big areas of interest is efficiency, and that is what Tiger Connects is about once we get there. It's also a major investment theme for me in healthcare, which is trying to find ways of replacing inefficient, usually labor-driven processes with software or technology-enabled services. So let's just spend a couple minutes on what opportunities you found in the device space with respect to efficiency and how you innovated in a company format to solve those problems.
Yeah, so in the device space, I love orthopedic surgery, and I was doing a lot of design work. In 2005, when I sold the surgery center business, at that point I had a fair amount of money. So I had been selling products, and then decided, I have this really good idea for a knee system that you could do. It was a modular system. You could replace one aspect of the knee, combine it with another, or do the full thing with matched instruments and fewer number of instrument trays. And basically my mindset came from the outpatient surgery environment, is that, hey, most of these people that are having knee arthroplasties are healthy, but we're putting them into a sick person's environment in a very expensive environment where they've got dietary services, all these types of things. So the company was focused on taking knee arthroplasty and bringing it into a more efficient outpatient environment with fewer number of steps, fewer number of instrument trays, and so forth. So with that company, there was a lot of mistakes that I think sort of came into play with that. Basically, my mindset was, hey, I already work with 200 surgeons in the surgery center business. Orthopedic surgeons are my people. If I have 50 orthopedic surgeons all using our components, it works out to a pretty good, high revenue number and so forth. The funding of that business, I ended up having an investor who was from a pharmaceutical background. He was the chairman of Teva Pharmaceuticals, also another physician. And his investment came into the company in 2008 with one caveat, and that was that we reverse merge and become a public company ourselves. So we did that in July of 2008, not exactly the best timing, but I learned a lot. That was another, huge mistake that we made. So we got sort of locked into that kind of a picture, but it worked its way out, and then ultimately we sold that to the largest sports med company called Arthrex.
And they have your device now being deployed, by your instrument trays deployed in their global commercial arm.
Yeah, all of Arthrex's implants were designed by Cardo Medical.
And so Cardo Medical was basically a play, not to oversimplify it, but taking a situation where you saw by modularizing the workflow, you could speed things up and simplify it, and still address all the patient needs you had.
Yeah, if you could take a patient and to me, patients should be kept out of the hospital. And if they're in a hospital, they should be moved through the hospital procession, if you will, in the most efficient way with alacrity. So knee patients, typically these recipients are very healthy people. They don't need to be put into a hospital. And if you can keep out of the hospital, then it really is win-win. It's lower cost, it's better for the patient, they're not exposed to germs and so forth.
And that's another one where timing was on your side as more and more procedures in that specialty moved from the hospital OR to the outpatient setting. Well, let's dig into Tiger Connect. So let's start with the story of how the company was founded. So how did you guys come up with the idea, and give us the kind of 3 to 5 minute understanding of how you and Brad conceived of the idea and where you thought the beachhead for the company would be?
Yeah, so 2010, I was in the midst of running the device company. The internet and communication around SMS messaging was really kind of on the rise. Medical records were going from paper to electronic. So we started talking quite a bit around how people text, how people are using Facebook, how essentially the default of the internet is permanence. And really kind of had this idea growing up watching Mission Impossible. Hey, Mr. Phelps, this tape will self-destruct in 5 minutes or 5 seconds. Maybe the default of our communication should be impermanence, and is there a way to create that digitally? So we had access to some very good engineers in Los Angeles, and initially set out to develop a messenger that was the core of it was ephemerality. Well, in order to do that, you have to have control of the message from the sender device to the receiver. It has to go over the data channel, and there's all kinds of encryption around that. Once we created that, at that point, it became a matter of looking at, say, okay, how do we make this into a business? You know, what are people going to need this for? Well, obviously, healthcare is one industry where privacy and control of information and the way you communicate it is of utmost importance. And physicians were increasingly texting more and more private health information. So, and there's laws around it called HIPAA. So initially, the core thing for the company, when we were going out in 2011 to sell the product, it was really more of a compliance sale, I would say, and going to organizations saying, hey, your folks are texting, here's a product that can, you know, very simply replace that, and it's encrypted. So that was really kind of how it started. Obviously, 6 years later, it's evolved into a completely different animal, but we can get into that.
So before we jump into where it is today, there was a timing component to the situation where you saw mobility plus the HITECH Act, digitize medical records. Physicians were one of the quickest adopters of mobile technology for professional use, but they were running afoul of regulations regarding patient confidentiality and security of information. So there was a timing aspect to it. One question that I want to raise with respect to ephemerality, which is, what is your philosophical view on why communication in healthcare might be valuable from an ephemeral perspective? So why would doctors ever want their conversations to not be recorded for all time?
Yeah, so essentially, I think when you watch television or you hear about healthcare and the way people deliver healthcare, it's sort of like portrayed in this like super formal way where it's, you know, yes, doctor, or nurse, or whatever, blah, blah, blah. So in reality, things are much more casual than that. And there are things that go on with conversations that are centered around clinical care that you may not necessarily want to have a permanent record of. So there are, you know, a conversation, you're an emergency room doc. A patient comes in and they're just completely blitzed out of their mind on, you know, drugs, and they were belligerent and whatever, they spat on you, all the things that I've seen. But if I come in...
Did you see that on TV?
Yeah, I experienced it at LA County multiple times. So I may come in there and you may say something like, oh, this patient is a real, you know, tough cookie and whatever. Probably some other choice words I would imagine you would say. But you may not necessarily want to have that on a permanent record type of basis. So that aspect of communication, the ephemerality is very important because you want to still preserve the way people naturally do communicate with medicine. There are some things that you want to opt into the permanence, which you can, but the core thing initially from our vantage point was preservation of that ephemerality and having some time limit that the sender could control or even recall would be of interest to physicians and nurses and people within the care team.
So when you guys founded Tiger Text at that point, how did you think about the way in which you would raise capital? Who did you decide would be, obviously we invested much later, but how did you decide what the pitch would be, and who did you decide would be the right partners initially to raise money from?
Yeah, so every company that I was involved with up until this one, we never really had former venture capital people. So in our naivete at the time, we thought, well, yeah, probably $5 million, maybe $7 million, and a bunch of engineers, we could have a really good product and probably create a pretty decent company. So just initially went, put my own money in, people that were close, a few other just angel type people that we knew. 7 years and $80 million later, I have a different view of the challenge of what it's been. But so, shortly after we started really realizing, okay, the internet type of business is a much longer play than what we really sort of anticipated. Both Brad and I really didn't come from that tech background. Brad's a finance guy. So we started reaching out to folks in Silicon Valley and ended up with venture money that's just continued to grow. And we've had some great partners, obviously, like you.
But how did you decide, so with interest, whether it was scant or substantial, were there attributes to an investor that you thought were more valuable or less valuable, besides just the size of the checkbook when you thought about raising money?
Oh, absolutely. I think that having met with pretty much most all of the top tier Silicon Valley VCs, because the space happened to be, again, timing wise, of interest to people. There are venture people who just want to write checks and drop in here and there, but don't necessarily add a lot of value. So one of the things that was very important to Brad and I was to look at the partners that we were going to bring into the company, or people that were interested and really were serious, and looked at it, say, okay, do they really understand what we're doing? Do they have some background in this? And are they, aside from just writing a check and just being, sort of dumb money, if you will, are they going to add something to the business? So we were fairly selective on that kind of thing, and just you yourself as a partner to us, the fact that you're still a practicing emergency room doctor, when we have our meetings, your input is just extraordinarily valuable, because you're in there real time and actually influence a lot of the roadmap and decision making of what we're doing. So that's hugely valuable for a startup company.
So, and back to the founding team, what are the criteria, now that you have this experience, Andrew, for early employees? So you're pretty big now, but when you guys started off, what were the personality traits or capabilities you looked for in the technical leadership, in the marketing leadership, et cetera, where you said, this is the person we want to hire at this stage in the company?
Yeah, so every company goes through different phases, and the people that are right at one phase, it changes at another phase. And that's certainly the case with a startup company. So in the very early part, for us, what we found, and I believe is the right thing, is you've got to have people that believe in the vision as strongly as you do, and are willing to take that passion and really put their heart and soul into what they're doing with you and the company, because it is such a difficult thing to sometimes conceptualize something and bring it into reality where everything is working very well. And if you don't have that level of shared passion and common desire to make it right and be fluid with one another, it would be very difficult. So, so I like people that don't mind if I'm emailing them at 2 a.m, they don't have to respond. Or you have an idea, or you're talking about something, and it's like 10:30 at night, they'll answer the phone. It kind of takes that from my vantage point. And so you have to have a ability to sort of have a threshold of pain that you're willing to put into your company being successful. And I think that's super important, particularly at the early stage.
So if it's at the mission-driven kind of high-intensity person at the beginning, walk through walls, is there a phase when you're looking for people that are that create process, create order? What's the next phase of team and investor that you look for?
Yeah, so definitely as you kind of move forward, just exactly as you said, process, order, because in the beginning you have people doing so many different tasks that may not necessarily be their respective particular area of expertise. But as a company starts to mature, you have more engineers, more salespeople, bugs start coming up, you have to have a support team, you have to have a process, you end up having more customers, you have to have implementation, you have to have leadership for that. So you definitely do start to upgrade and change people and have their roles be far more specific than it is in the beginning. And then from an investor standpoint, the kind of investor who invests early on, I was just talking to Saeed a little bit at the very beginning. If you're going to write a check that's a relatively small check, let's say $50,000, $100,000, $200,000, because you believe in someone's idea, you're basically looking at the idea, but more importantly, you're probably looking at the person and hoping that the person's going to execute on this particular idea. The later stage investors are more risk averse. They want to see, oh, you've got some track record, you've got some traction. Yeah, we're willing to pay up for that lower risk. The valuation is obviously going to be higher. And it's a different kind of gambit for that kind of an investor. So, and then even as you go further down the road, it becomes even kind of another version of that.
So let's move to Tiger Connect now and Tiger Flow. So if initially the company was positioned toward providing a priority channel of communication for physicians that was encrypted and compliant, what is Tiger Connect now? What is Tiger Flow? And what does it do, to go back to your initial theme, for health system efficiency?
Yeah, so just to kind of distill down what Tiger Connect is today, it's a workflow company. And what we do is we tether electronically all these different siloed aspects of digital information and route it to the various constituents that are involved in the care of a particular patient. So the information that's germane to making decisions to move the patient through a process, that's what we do, is we provide that kind of a system. I believe, because I've seen it now with so many institutions, that if you look at American healthcare and you say, you read these studies that people come out with, oh, America's number 20 in the world, and Denmark is much better to be sick than America. Like I say bullshit to that. We have the best healthcare. If you've got a bad problem, if you've got some strange autoimmune thing, you got cancer of some sort, and you can access the right treatment, America's where you want to be. It's a huge part of our economy, obviously. It's, roughly 18% of our GDP. We have plenty of money in the system, but our process is fundamentally broken. I have a friend who has an internal medicine practice. He's at Cedars-Sinai. There's 3 of them in the office. To this day, they still get over 15,000 faxes a year coming into their office. There's 2 million pagers in place in American medicine today. So aside from drug dealers, I really don't know too many other organizations, people that are using pagers. So what Tiger Connect does is essentially take the way you operate in your consumer life and bring it into healthcare so that the patient experience is smoother, quicker. If you can move a patient through an event very more rapidly and more efficiently, the cost is far less. So there is literally hundreds of billions of dollars to be saved. And we've seen this through studies that have been done with our own customers. Just in bed transport time, you can see a patient in the emergency room, the old paradigm of, hey, we're going to call bed transport, the patient's going to wait, then ultimately they get paged or whatever. Now it's all part of the same care team. They're in the ER. Bed transport gets notified, and we've seen that it's the outer concentric circles of care that actually tend to really affect a lot of the process. It isn't just physicians and nurses. It's bringing in the lab, bringing in the radiology services, dietary. We have a customer in Pennsylvania, Geisinger. They've brought all the dietary people onto the platform because people have varying dietary needs. So it really is just about just this efficiency of process, and we're making massive differences with our customers.
Well, I mean, clearly I'm biased, but when you look at the platform now, Tiger Flow, Tiger Connect, it is a software version of the way communication between, now we call them providers, physician, nurses, and other individuals was before. I think timing also played a big role because during your and my generation of medicine, medical experience, we went from single provider to shift-based in almost every specialty, shift-based, which is shift-based and role-based communication. So instead of who cares where Dr. Mittendorf is, who's the red ER doctor on right now? Because they're responsible for bed 4, which is patient John Smith. Who's the nurse covering bed 4, not who's Betty or John covering bed 4. And I think the use of technology to, something you guys have done really well, to capture in technology what the natural flow of communication is in healthcare is important. And then the other part I think is important is that you've taken synchronous communication, which is really inefficient for most of what we do, to mostly 80% or so asynchronous, where I don't need the answer right now. I don't need to call you on a SpectraLink phone. I can text you or send you a picture or send you even a video now and ask you to respond in time to that. So given that you have this much broader, platform now, and I forget, I don't know how publicly, I want to step on your toes. How many health systems or hospitals are we in now? Are you in at Tiger Connect?
We're just, at this point, eclipsing 4,000 healthcare organizations, and we have about just close to about 300,000 paid subscribers on the platform. So pretty massive scale at this point, which we can get into another aspect of how that's actually benefiting and cross-pollinating information from varying organizations to each other.
Right, because you now have a big graph of healthcare providers because they're working at multiple institutions. You have information on them. You know how you don't know what they're texting or sending, but you have frequency of use and you have endpoints. Do you send more text to dermatology than I do, or more communications of some kind? How do you think about that data network effect right now at Tiger Connect?
It's huge. We invested quite a bit about 3 years ago in analytics. We have a whole team actually up here in Palo Alto that is just all they do is work on the analytics aspect of things. And what we see with that is you can see an organization where a patient is set up for discharge, and that process could take a day and a half. But you could then take that exact process and say, okay, go to another organization, say, hey, this is kind of what we're seeing you do. It's taking a day and a half. This organization does it like this, and their process is being reduced to about 8 hours. So by going into our customers and actually being a little bit more, well, not a little bit, a lot more consultative and prescriptive to varying pain points that they have, it's been hugely beneficial to them. Actually to the point where we have such confidence in it that we're willing to even go at risk with a customer on that. We can say, hey, your time for, when you order a consult, from the time it's ordered to the time it's done, we've had customers where that could be upwards of 23 hours. So if we can reduce that to, let's say, 6 hours or 8 hours, obviously the patient isn't sitting there languishing, waiting for someone to come and take care of them on this consult. So we can affect process in that way. When you affect process, you reduce time in the organization, and every minute that people are in the hospital costs a lot of money.
I think So, and that's actually, as you go from, say, a day and a half to 8 hours, one of the fundamental philosophic changes that I watched you all innovate around was this simple concept of taking a pull approach, which is I log into Epic, I'm an Epic user, I log into Epic to see if all the labs are back, or see if radiology is done, or there's a little blinker that says that all that's done, but I have to log in to a push workflow, push notification where if all labs are back or if radiology is done, since you're integrated with EMR, you can push and say, you don't have to tell me what the CT read is, we can say CT results are back, which prompts me to move the ball down the field the next 10 yards. Are there any generalizable lessons in terms of process improvement and the subsequent ROI that you guys have talked about before? What are the major lessons there in terms of efficiency improvement?
Well, I mean, essentially, if you can reduce time from a lot of healthcare is about just getting answers to very simple questions. So there's a lot of phone tag that goes on. So I'll give you a very relatable, easy thing to understand. We have a physician at a hospital in Newport Beach, at Hoag Hospital, very well-known hospital, reads a lot of MRs. Well, if he's reading 70, 80 MRs a day, maybe there might be 8 or 9 that have critical information that he needs to transmit to the person who requested the study. The normal workflow prior was, I'm going to call the office, leave a message. Now, if it's an orthopedic surgeon, maybe the person's there, maybe they're at their kid's soccer game, then you call back. He may be in the room doing an arthrogram or whatever. So there's all this phone tag that goes on. So now you take it to the Tiger Connect workflow. That abnormal study is now pushed to the person. They get a priority alert. It shows up as a little red badge on their phone, has a different sound. The person can open it, see the report, see the abnormal image, and then communicate back to the person and say, geez, I'm surprised by that. What do you think about the lymph nodes? And even to the point where even now we have VoIP involved where without even knowing that person's phone number, you can hit the telephone icon and actually call them through the VoIP aspect of it and say, tell me about this, tell me about that. So it just really has had massive impact across this whole efficiency of process.
Great. Well, so I want to talk about a couple final topics, 2 final topics. The first one is selling and implementing in health systems. So if you were to break down sales pitch approaches, and there's many ways to do this, in healthcare IT or in selling to health systems, there's the relationship sale, there's the compelling logic sale, hey, this just makes sense, and then there's the ROI data-driven sale, which I think you guys are at now. But how important and at what phase did showing evidence of and I don't mean clinical trial, but evidence of value become in the selling process to health systems? And how was it to be involved? I know you were heavily involved, Andrew, in a number of the big system sales. How was it to be involved in those system sales, and what did those systems generalizably ask for of the company?
Yeah, so the sales side of things, this is probably for us, what seems so obvious, like, wow, why wouldn't everybody want to buy this? Like, this seems like this is a no-brainer. The cost of the product is a fraction of whatever EMR is. We can essentially guarantee an ROI. This is kind of a no-brainer. But with our particular product, what we've learned is that if you come in through the IT side of things, it's a much more challenging sale because IT looks at things very differently than the clinicians. So where we've sort of come down on this thing, and now as time has gone on, it's kind of moved more up to the C-level aspect of things because they're being pinched on their own earnings with hospitals. It's becoming far more difficult for them to remain profitable. So we talk about this sort of holy trinity, if you will, for a sale into a large system. And that's buy-in on the IT side. The IT people don't need another thing jammed into their system for them to have to now worry about. And so once you get them over the hurdle of understanding that this really isn't like an implementation of a very super complicated thing, it's quite easy, that's certainly helpful. clinician buy-in is critical. You must have physician leaders within an organization that actually will stand up and help to really ram it through and have people change their habits. We're as much in the change management business as we are in the tech business. And then obviously the C-level side of things also needs to understand, hey, we need this. Our process is fundamentally broken, and technology is really the way forward. So it's very much an educational process that we go through, and it doesn't end at the sale. We've got about a third of the company at this point is what goes on after the sale with customer success, implementation, going back into these organizations and looking at what they're doing and being prescriptive, as I was talking about earlier, around, hey, this is what we're seeing here, do this, do that. And that's a very big part of what the company's doing right now.
Great. So I have one last question for you, Andrew. And I'm going to give you, think about this while I'm asking you the question, but none of this was scripted before, so I did not ask him this question before this today, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So if you were to roll forward 10, 15, 20 years, and you were to think about 20 years ago when you were, maybe longer than that for you, but 20 years ago when we were training, and you were to think about, there were, I've gone through 3 Epic rollouts. I'm sure you've been through a bunch. I went from paper orders to electronic. There were fundamental changes there. If you were to think about the practice of medicine in 10 to 15 years, what are the 3 biggest fundamental shifts? Maybe, and not think broader than your specialty, that you'll expect to see. I mean, one would be laparoscopic surgery was one in surgery. It just took over and changed the landscape of how operating worked. Can you give me 3 examples, or even 2, of fundamental changes in the practice of medicine that will probably be a result of technology in the next 10 to 15 years?
Well, I would say, from my vantage point, a few things I see are going to change. I think biologic treatment of disease is, without question, going to have a massive impact on how we treat patients. A lot of the stuff we do to people, and it's in my specialty as orthopedic surgeon as well, is somewhat barbaric in my estimation. And there are more elegant things that we're now just at the very beginning scratching the surface of. And I think these types of things are going to be far more impactful on the way we treat patients. I think the other macro thing that's going to occur is a lot of things that people are getting treated for are going to go by the wayside. I think there's a lot of things that go on with treatment of patients that's way over. And I think as we start to get more data around artificial intelligence and these buzzwords that people throw around like machine learning, I actually do believe that we will start to reduce the way people actually approach healthcare. So in my practice as a tertiary referral type sports med person, I would see a lot of people that would play 5 sets of tennis. They're like a 50-year-old person, and on a Sunday, then they come into the office Tuesday because their shoulder's sore. Well, that person should never come to a tertiary shoulder surgeon. They are, in 95% of cases, going to get better. So I think on the front side of healthcare, people will probably be more kept out of expensive treatments, but it's going to be driven by data. So there's a lot of wood to chop there, but it's going to happen. People are overtreated. I personally think in the United States, on any given day, at least 50% of surgery being done is unnecessary. And I know that's a bold statement, but I truly believe that.
Great. Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to interview you today, Andrew, and I hope you guys all enjoyed this conversation out there. I don't think, we might not be around much longer today, but our contact information we'll leave with Plug and Play. I'm happy to follow up by email or by telephone. Thank you so much.
Thank you.